This feast of Christ the King poses certain problems, doesn't it? We are Americans. We don't do kings. Well, we don't. You know, the nation was founded precisely to escape from the excesses of tyrannical monarchy. And I'm Irish, and we particularly don't do kings. Maybe it's because we look across the Irish Sea and we see the antics of the House of Windsor, and we think to ourselves, no, none of that. When I was a graduate student, I went to Oxford for a summer, and a friend of mine who was thoroughly British prevailed upon me to go up to, or actually they would say go down to London, because Diana was showing the second kid to the public, and I can never remember which is which, but it was the younger of the two. And they loved Diana because she had given them, as my friend put it, an heir and a spare. So against my better judgment, I went down to London. And it's a big city, very crowded streets. We did get a really great lunch, Indian food, of course. And then we made our way over to Kensington Palace. It's a nice piece of real estate. Let's stipulate that. They lived in a nice house. Big stone and wrought iron fence surrounding the gardens, and the iron was gilded, tipped with gold. And I didn't get real close, I'll say that. I was way, 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 way in the back. And Diana and the guy she married, what was his name? The big ears. They came out onto the balcony of Kensington Palace, his ears gently waving in the breeze. That was mean, wasn't it? And she showed the baby. And the crowd went berserk. Old ladies were crying, young couples were kissing, kids were jumping up and down, and I stood there with my face fixed like flint. Because I just don't get kings. So, for those of you who share my, shall we say, anti-monarchical biases, what do we do with this feast of Christ the King? Perhaps instead of thinking about Saudi princelings or Germans converted to Brits and now ruling in places like Kensington Palace, why don't we look at the scriptures? And here in John's Gospel, we have a very paradoxical presentation of Jesus as king. This is right out of the Passion narrative. And when you think about the plot of John's Gospel, they've just beaten Jesus as part of the ordinary processes of arraignment. Some of you may well remember Hawaii Five-0, booking Dano, right? When they booked Jesus, they beat him. This was before he had been found guilty of whatever trumped-up charges they wanted to bring against him. So he is weakened here. And that's important. And he comes face to face with Pilatus, with Pilate, the representative of the oppressive might of Rome. And one can hear the thinly veiled contempt in Pilate's language here. Are you the king of the Jews? You who are weak, you who are beaten, you who are bloody. And you'll note that Jesus is uneasy with this language of kinship. You say this on your own? Somebody else give you those categories? My kingdom, such that it is not of this world. It is not a kingdom of palaces with stone and wrought iron walls. It's not a kingdom of yards and yards of watered silk training down an aisle. It's not a kingdom of ermine. It's not a kingdom of power. It's not a kingdom of wealth. And Pilate just doesn't get it, right? So are you a king or not? Jesus refuses to be captured in our categories of kingship. I think probably the best way to understand Jesus' kingship is through his own words. For this I was born. For this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Jesus tells us the truth about God. He tells us the truth about himself. He tells us the truth about ourselves. What does he tell us about God? Well, I think when you go through any of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and you see Jesus doing what he does, proclaiming the reign of God, healing people, raising people from the dead, we see that what he tells us about God is that God desires nothing more than that we be healed, that our hurts be bound up, that our injuries be fixed, and that even that ancient enemy of death somehow be vanquished. He tells us the truth about himself, that his power is paradoxical, that it is the power of powerlessness, that his weakness is strength. And he tells us the truth about ourselves, that any quest for power, for riches, for influence, for status, is somehow doomed to leave us dissatisfied. I've heard it said that human beings have a kind of God-shaped hole in their hearts, and that nothing other than God will fill that hole. Oh, we try, to do other things. Palaces with stone and wrought iron gilded walls, watered silk trains, ermine, the corner office, an endowed fellowship. We try all of those things, and yet it never really works, does it? We find ourselves empty, looking for something else. The only thing that will fill that God-shaped hole in the human heart is God. God who comes to us in this itinerant rabbi from a far-flung province, actually an obscure province, in a small town within that province, a town so small it's never mentioned in the Torah or the prophets. Nazareth. It's like, I don't know, Sikeston. Nowhere. Sorry for those of you who are natives of Sikeston. Do we have anybody here? I would apologize after Mass, except that I have to go to the airport, so email me and I'll apologize to you. But when we celebrate, as we'll begin next week, the Feast of Advent, we will not celebrate during this season someone who, came in power, someone who lived a life of majesty. We will celebrate the birth of a child to a refugee couple. We will celebrate someone who lived for the first 30 years of his life in obscurity. We'll celebrate someone who willingly embraced the suffering that came to him by virtue of being human, by virtue of being misunderstood. That is Christ the King. That is the one in whose name we gather on this Sunday and on every Sunday. So what do we do with all of that? If Jesus manifests his power here precisely in powerlessness, then how are we to react to that? The world in which we live, it seems to me, is filled with people who are powerless, vulnerable. It does seem to me that if we take this image of Jesus seriously, that then when we encounter these persons who are powerless and vulnerable, weak, bloody, beaten, we will see in them some facet, some aspect of Jesus who is King. My guess is that on my way to the airport, perhaps as I get off at the exit where my parking garage is, in honor of Diana and the guy with the big ears, we'll pronounce that garage today. There's probably going to be someone standing there with one of those signs that says, "We'll work for food." And of course, you probably noticed, it's cold out. Chances are, these folks that stand there at the freeway exits might have spent last night outside. These are images of Christ the King. Powerless, vulnerable, beaten, bloody. We do not gather today in honor of someone clad in ermine and sequestered behind stone and wrought iron gates. We celebrate a poor Jesus. We celebrate a beaten Jesus. We celebrate one who is vulnerable and powerless. And we ask our God that our eyes be open today to see him and the people that we meet in our day, in our city, in our time, who are similarly vulnerable, beaten, powerless, and bloody.